Milling refers to effects that send cards to the top of a player's deck to the graveyard. This is a concept borrowed from Magic the Gathering and has its name from the first notable card to have this kind of ability, the Millstone. Like many other concepts and other TCGs at the time, milling was something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Incorporated really early on, to varying degrees of success. In this video, we'll be going over all the notable mill decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! And the history of the mechanic in general. The main idea behind the original mill decks from Magic was to make use of the deck out win condition, in which if your opponent has to draw a card while they have no cards in their deck, they lose the game. This is a rule which Yu-Gi-Oh! Borrowed without change, and it's been part of the game's core since day one. The first card to become associated with these kinds of deck out strategies would be Morphing Jar. This is a low-level monster which makes both players discard their hands and draw 5 whenever it's flipped face up. Morphing Jar is much more than just a mill enabler, because it can also swing around advantage massively in both players' favors. In mill though, this card takes a huge chunk out of your opponent's deck, and if used while they have less than 5 cards in there, wins you the game on the spot. This card was released in the OCG Booster 5 series, all the way back in 1999, and it also would bring Needleworm. This is another flip monster which makes your opponent send the top 5 cards of their deck to the graveyard when flip face up. These two would go on to form the backbone of the Deck Destruction, a popular deck archetype during the early OCG meta. With 3 copies of both Jar and Worm, as well as there being very little counterplay to flip effects at the time, this was actually a quite formidable strategy back then. A huge perk this deck had was a great matchup against Exodia, which was a pretty consistent deck due to having every limb at 3, as well as powerful draw spells like Graceful Charity. Since there wasn't any good way to recover pieces from the graveyard yet, Deck Destruction could secure early wins by getting the 3 copies of a part there. A few months down the line, this deck would get 2 extra jars added to its arsenal. The first being Cyber Jar, which when flipped destroys all monsters in the field and makes both players reveal the top 5 cards of the decks, special summon all level 4 or lower monsters to the field, and then add the remaining cards to their hand. This card not only deck thinned your opponent for 5 like the other ones, it could also summon more of the jars in face down defense position. All of this while being mass field removal and fill up your hand too. The next one was Morphing Jar number 2, which when flipped shuffles all monsters in the field into the deck, and then each player has to send cards from the top of their deck to the graveyard until they find as many monsters that were shuffled, and then they special summon all excavated level 4 or lower monsters. Though number 2 was the only one who didn't guarantee at least a mill 5, it also did not have a limit in how much it could mill. The only reason why these full power mill decks didn't erase Exodia from the meta completely was that they got Backup Soldier, a trap that can recover up to 3 normal monsters back from the graveyard. With that said, discarding all their heads remained a valid win con. The power of Deck Destruction was such that even though cards to blink flip effects had been released in the meantime, like Nobleman Crossout and Ceasefire, the deck still had to get severely hit by the OCG ban list, which put both Morphing Jar number 2 and Cyber Jar at 1. Even after that, this strategy becomes stronger than ever before with Makyura the Destructor coming out. The pre-errata version of the card would allow you to activate trap cards from your hand the turn it was sent to the graveyard, which paired well with the pre-errata Exchange of the Spirit, which swaps both players' graveyards in their decks if you have 15 or more cards there. The idea was to use Morphing Jar or Card Destruction to trigger Makyura, then draw into more cards and fill your graveyard up until you had Exchange of the Spirit live. At this point, you'd usually be leaving your opponent with 5 cards in deck, which would mean another trigger of Jar would finish them off. This was a very competent strategy in Japan, which could achieve its OTK extremely quickly if you drew well enough. This would be the last hurrah for Deck Destruction over there, as not long after it ravaged the metagame, Konami would release a nuke ban list, which would limit several cards crucial to it, including Upstart, Reckless, Makyura, Card D, and even Jar itself. For comparison, we never really got this schism in the TCG. Due to how our releases worked, when we ended up getting them, both Cyber Jar and Morphing Jar were already limited. Not only that, but the deck's good matchup versus Exodia didn't matter, as that wasn't a viable deck for us due to similar hits. Still, despite having its main combo pieces put to 1, players would eventually be shown that a Deck Destruction strategy could still succeed in the meta. In the 2005 World Championship, a deck focused around getting the most value out of your 2 available jars would be one of the breakouts of the event. The main goal of the strategy was to reuse the jars through the books and Shallow Grave, before eventually finishing your opponent off with Serial Spell plus Card Destruction combo. Though it wasn't taken very seriously in much of the western side of the world, this deck out list managed to win the Mexican Nationals of that year, and then go all the way to 2nd place in Worlds. This deck would eventually become known as Empty Jar, and though people would try to recreate the success in other formats, it never quite managed to get as far as it did at this time. However, this remains a valid strategy in GOAT, one of the most popular retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Formats where it's been used to a decent amount of success. The Jar cards would still see tons of play throughout the years, and Morphing Jar even remains limited to this day. But they were mostly played as huge haymakers, and not as actual win cons like in the previous instances. The Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta would progress from this point forwards, and though there were many powerful cards which incidentally milled, like Don Zalug and Vampire Lord, that would never be the main selling point of those cards. Burn would be the most popular alternate win condition, due to their numerous enablers being around. These decks benefited more from floodgates since they could better maneuver a slow game, and even got to play powerful game enders such as Ring of Destruction and Magic Cylinder. Mill decks also had the disadvantage of filling up your opponent's graveyard. Though you could take out crucial limited cards out of the picture, like Heavy Storm, you were even more likely to fill your opponent's graveyard with monsters, which could then be brought back or used to fuel the summon conditions of the Chaos monsters, which were a huge part of the meta. From this point onwards, there'd be little relevancy to mill decks for a long while, and though there was some support for the deck around, the strategy simply wasn't worth trying outside of trying to abuse the jars. From this point onwards, graveyard synergies would only become more and more common, making sending cards from your opponent's deck to the graveyard even more of a liability. Card Trooper became a staple as soon as it was released, a card which milled 3 from your deck every turn. We also would get cards like Treeborn Frog, which is a +1 every turn while it's in the graveyard, and you control no back row. This would eventually culminate in the release of the Lightsworns, the first archetype based entirely around milling, but only it's your own deck. Most of the Lightsworn monsters can send cards from the top of your controller's deck to the graveyard during the end phase, which helped turn on many of the cards in their engine and outside of it. This is where the notion of the graveyard is the second hand would begin to emerge. And as we progressed into the Synchro era, there was no shortage of decks which wanted these free mills. At this point, a lot of decks were splashing cards like Raikou just to get that shot at triggering a graveyard effect for free. Still, it was just around this era where we'd see a way to deck an opponent out come into the metagame in Maxx C. This hand trap is supposed to try and stop the opponent by making you draw a card every time they special summon a monster. The notable thing is that you are forced to draw. So, if the opponent can somehow special summon enough times, you can force them to draw until they have nothing left in the deck. This was usually accomplished through not once per turn effects like Colossal Fighter and Level Leader, and though it very rarely happened, it was a risk you had to be aware of when maxing. It wasn't until 2013 where we'd see an actual strategy based entirely around this all-win condition again, and that was with the Gishki FTK. In short terms, this was a deck which would use draw power such as Royal Magical Library, trade in an Upstart Goblin to assemble a loop with Gishki Mine-August, who shuffles back cards from the graveyard into the deck when it's summoned. The endgame with this loop was to reuse cards like Dark World Dealings, which would make both players draw, until your opponent decked out. This strategy did not see that much representation because it was hard to play and took a really long time to execute, usually taking over 30 minutes for a single turn if the combo went through. The issues with this decks were more or less the same that modern attempts at Empty Jar does, and that they perfectly illustrate why this kind of deck out strategy can never be that impressive. Since the loop involves both you and your opponent drawing through your decks, that means the opponent will have to play through every single hand trap they've got. Back in the day, you were limited to just Effect Veiler and DD Crow, but these were often more than enough to put a stop to the FTK. This quirk of the deck even led to a notable player citing a singular copy of Neko Main King as a silver bullet against the deck back in the day. Neko Main ends your opponent's turn if it's sent to the graveyard by opponent's card effect during their turn, which is exactly what Dark World Dealings and Card Destruction did. The existence of this loop even led to Mine-August being limited for years afterwards. This FTK is entirely legal these days and doesn't cause any trouble though due to the immense variety of hand traps we have in the meta nowadays. Even if they do manage to get their combo started, odds are it won't be able to play through the copies of Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, or even worse, Droll and Lockbird. That's the same reason people say Morphine Jar can come back to 3 in today's metagame, and also why we'd never see a deck out strategy like these two be competitive ever again. From here, this win con became more of a novelty than anything else, only being the main feature of extremely casual strategies. As a few examples, we've had Ghost Trick Skeleton, which can banish cards from the top of your opponent's deck face down, up to the number of Ghost Tricks you control. Though banishing cards face down is good, milling so little and at such a glacial pace means it'd probably be faster to try to win by attacking with its 1200 bodies several times instead. There's Inferno Tempest, which can banish all the monsters from your opponent's deck and graveyard, but it leaves them with all their resources on hand and field, and usually is going to require a 3-card combo between a 0-attack monster, a kaiju, and Tempest itself. We've also had Mayakashi, a zombie archetype which can chain special summon several times in a single turn through its not once per turn Daki and Soul Absorbing Bone Tower to mill your opponent out. This was probably one of the best deck out strategies around, though it still relied on somewhat inconsistent combos that dies to a single interaction. While this sort of deck continued to flounder in the TCG, around 2017 we'd get Duel Links, an alternate format which includes skills and greatly limited card pools. With a 20-card main deck as well as power levels matching 2002 Yu-Gi-Oh!, we had none of the good staples. This was the perfect environment for a mill deck to thrive in. It was called Taya Mill because it used the Taya skill Duel Standby, which made both players start out with 5 cards in hand instead of the usual 4. Many cards that were completely useless in the TCG made the core of this strategy, such as Warm Worm, which mills your opponent for 3 when it's destroyed, and Hero Shadow Scout, which makes your opponent draw 3 on flip. These two, coupled with battle traps such as a Faint Plan, and the game's extremely limited means of removal for both monsters and back row, provided the perfect environment for a stall deck like this to thrive. This was one of the most hated strategies on the ladder for a while, which even led to Duel Links having Hero on the ban list for years. In 2019, we'd get a card which would make Arise the same kind of vitriol in the TCG. It encouraged the same kind of stall playstyle, though it was probably hated magnitudes more than the aforementioned mill strategy, and that was Mystic Mine. This is a field spell which makes it so the player which controls more monsters currently cannot activate monster effects or attack, and if both players have the same number of monsters out, it destroys itself during the end phase. Mine was played either as a dedicated strategy or as a going second option in decks. As its own deck, the strategy was just to sit on the floodgate with 0 monsters out, and have something like Field Barrier to make sure it wouldn't destroy itself ever. From there, you would just burn them to death with Cauldron of the Old Man. However, the card was even more obnoxious when splashed into other strategies. By just playing a playset of mines into other decks, you get access to a great going second option against monster-heavy strategies. After activating Mine, there'd be 2 outcomes. Either you'd bait a spell trap negate, or you'd lock your opponent out of doing anything until they drew an out. The thing is that, since you were likely playing a deck which your opponent wouldn't normally side back or removal against, there likely wasn't an out. If that was the case, you could just pass back and forth between each player until your opponent decked out. This interaction warped deck building around it while Mine was around, and there was never a good answer to it. Many decks had to fill in at least one piece of back removal in the main somewhere as to not risk being decked out by Mine, even if the card would be subpar against every other matchup, just in case someone was maining Mine. Many who did not want to make this concession would end up having to forfeit many game 1-ofs when they got hit by the card, lest they'd waste half the time of the round passing until they decked out. In this sense, Mystic Mine was the perfect floodgate to support a deck out strategy, since most of the time what you drew didn't matter. Some decks which go beyond this and bank it all on Mystic Mine going second by preparing an out to your opponent's out. This was something that Sprite did last year, since they'd go for Mine and then use Beat Cop from the Underworld to tribute itself and put a counter that protected Mine from destruction. This was really effective against Tearlaments, who have been recently playing a single copy of Galaxy Cyclone, which can destroy face-up spells by banishing it from the graveyard. Mystic Mine was one of the most hated cards in the game due to the degenerate playstyle enabled, up until it was finally banned after 3 years of legality. However, though Mine was the only viable avenue for a deck out in a really long time, as it passed away, we'd see quite a few modern decks which were more than capable of doing so. The first of these would be Runick. The archetype spells all have 2 effects, where they can either be used to impact the field somehow and then banish cards from the top of your opponent's deck, or special summon one of their extra deck monsters. However, you would have to skip the next battle phase after activating either of these effects. The Runick engine is pretty good at generating advantage since their field spell effectively replaces every Runick card you use with a random draw. And their spells have quite useful and varied effects, such as popping back row or negating monsters. The idea behind Runick cards is that since you don't get a battle phase, banishing cards from top of your opponent's deck until they deck out becomes your win condition. This gets around the main issue with Mill in modern times, as while there are a few cards that get their effects off when banished, the vast majority of decks don't have them. In this, Runick have a bit of a niche in the spirit of the original Mill decks, in that you're taking away important resources from your opponent's deck, which they probably won't be able to gain access to again. With this said, though some people did play Runick as a primary stall and deck out strategy, it was mainly used as an engine for other decks such as Makyura and Sprite. While the Runick version of these strategies do retain the ability to deck your opponent out if they need to, they usually just amass advantage and they can spend a turn without activating Runick cards and then go for game that way. However, things went a bit differently in Master Duel due to being a best of 1 and having access to options like Card of Demise at 3 at some point. The stun variant ran amok on the ladder up until it had to be addressed with many hits on the ban list. The next deck capable of milling you out in recent memory was Tearlament Ishizu, more specifically the Ishizu half. Yugioh or Kelbeck make both players mill 5 cards when sent from the hand or deck to the graveyard. Or in Yugioh's case 10 if you got Exchange of the Spirit in there, the same card that was used for the mill OTK 20 years ago. With that being said, Exchange was very rarely an inclusion in the deck, as being able to mill 5 from trigger of Yugioh and Kelbeck was more than enough. Usually you'd often be activating these cards during your opponent's turn as well. The then tier 0 deck could beat pretty much any other that came in their way, only struggling if they had access to a really strong floodgate like Dimension Shifter or Abyss Dweller. Despite tier not having a very good out to towers like the Arrival, or even an Avermax with Destruction Protection, the deck still had a very good matchup against decks that made these. And that's because, in the case that your opponent made something you couldn't out, you could just loop Yugioh and Kelbeck every turn by putting them back into the deck with Mudora or Keldo, up until your opponent had no cards left in their deck. These cards did all get sent to the graveyard, where it might turn on an opponent's revival spell, or even give them a small plus. But the advantage the tier player would get by getting bodies and searches with the Tearlament cards would be insurmountable, and they could just stall out until deck out. This is why no other deck could ever beat tiers when it came to the grind game, and this ability to use and reuse resources was also why the mirror matches could end up taking so much time. At the very least, it is something we no longer have to worry about for the most part with the deck being so crippled by the ban list. The last deck which plays into this deck destruction deal is Kashtira. Their level 4 monster, Kashtira Riseheart, banishes the top 3 cards of your opponent's deck face down as part of its effect. This is relevant because of Kashtira Shangri-La, which can lock your opponent out of using a zone on the board every time a card they possess is banished face down. This would be their only way to lock zones during their first turn, if not for number 89, Diabolus the Mind Hacker, an older card whose effects only became relevant as of late. Basically, Diabolus looks at your opponent's extra deck and banishes a card from their face down. And when a card is banished face down, it can make your opponent banish cards from the top of their deck equal to the number of their banished face down cards they have. And this triggers Shangri-La twice. Of the mainline Kashtira lines involving using both Riseheart and Diabolus to lock 3 of your opponent's zones, and as a side effect, this will end up banishing 8 of their cards face down, 7 of them from the main and 1 from the extra. However, during your opponent's turn, since many of the Kashtira cards are able to banish your opponent's cards as interaction, you're able to trigger Diabolus again. And this time, it's going to be getting an even bigger chunk of their deck. This is the best way to mill an opponent, as cards which are banished face down are almost impossible to recover outside of the one whose deck does this, Kashtira. If the game ever goes down to a grind, the Kash player can trigger Riseheart, Tearlaments Kashtira, and Diabolus in just the right way to deck your opponent out. Though the actual deck out doesn't come up much, losing important 1-ofs due to the first turn setup is currently one of the most annoying parts of dealing with Kashtira in the current metagame. This is where deck out strategies stand in Yu-Gi-Oh for now. With both Kashtira and Runick being top tier decks at the time of writing, deck outs might not be as uncommon as they once were, but they're still very rarely seen and not the main strategy behind these archetypes. What these two have in common is that they're often decking you out in addition to gaining advantage with their cards, rather than focusing on that specific effect over everything else. The fact that both of these strategies banish cards instead of sending them to the graveyard is also huge, as your opponent is very rarely getting an advantage out of them. Even so, Runick can sometimes have a bad time against Despia and Kashtira because their cards are banished face up, and both these cards can plus off and interact with having their cards banished. The main disadvantage historically with mill decks has been that putting resources in your opponent's graveyard was bad even from the first few years of the game, and that the win con wasn't as reliable as burn. The solution to letting the opponent utilize those resources was to be able to kill them extremely quickly, preferably in one turn, which led to the mild success of both Empty Jar and Gishki FTK. However, as we've discussed before, this kind of strategy is completely non-viable due to the overabundance of hand traps roaming around. Konami's experiment with mill decks have been far and few between, with Runick being really recent, and this aspect of cash being seemingly unintended. This is probably because the players tend to hate going up against these playstyles, since not only does it solve the game, it also adds an extra sense of luck into a match by adding the possibility of losing 1-ofs in your deck that you might need. That's the main reason why pure Runick is so hated in Master Duel, and one of the reasons why Diabolus is one card everybody wants banned at the moment. As for the future mill decks, it's unclear if Konami will make any other archetypes which support it soon. But Runick, at least, is probably staying around for a while, as they've just had some new support announced in the OCG. Still, Cyber Jar and Morphin Jar remain limited, and though they might not be as relevant now, their place in Forbidden Limitless shows how impactful and feared the original deck destruction used to be. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of any good way this mechanic could be fixed, or know of any other cards you'd like to see covered, please let us know down in the comments below.